Hi, I'm Mike Davis, owner of Extra Mile Technology Services, and today we're talking about ransomware. What we're going to cover is the history of ransomware, how to protect yourself, and then how to protect your network. So, for the history of it, there was ransomware that was transmitted via floppy disks back in 1989. But for our discussion today, we're talking about the variations that started in about 2013, 2014, that time frame, where the attackers would get on your system one way or another and encrypt all your files. Now, those first attacks in that first year, it was pretty simple. They'd get onto your system, and as soon as they did, they would launch their encryption software, and then at the end of it, it would pop up a note saying, hey, all your files are encrypted. If you want to see them again, pay us $300. Well, one Bitcoin, which was about $300 at that time. And Bitcoin is not traceable, wasn't traceable then, still isn't traceable now. And that's part of the problem with the whole thing, is that for the most part, we know where these gangs that are operating these sophisticated attacks are coming from, but our government and even Interpol and the international organizations are having a real hard time dealing with it, because so much of it is able to be done anonymously and that kind of stuff. So that's part of the problem with this type of crime. So the next variation of the ransomware attacks, they would encrypt your system after they figured out if it was a business or if it was a home user. And if it was a home user, they'd leave it at $300. If it was a business, they might demand $5,000, $10,000, six figures, depending on what they thought the size of your business was and how hard they thought it might be for you to recover. And one of the things that was true then and is still true now is they're often willing to negotiate, because like any hostage situation or ransom situation, getting something is better than getting nothing. And sometimes they would rather, get less money today than to get a little bit more money tomorrow, or take a chance on not getting the money tomorrow. So you have to remember that when we talk about what to do if you get hit later. So in the next variation, they would get onto your system and they would do a little bit of homework and figure out where your backups were and how you're backing up your system. And if it was a online backup, or if it was a backup to a NAS drive or another disk drive in another system or something, they would try to delete your backups, then encrypt your system. Okay? And the next wave, again, the backups were a great line of defense against having to pay the ransom. So the next version, they would get on your system, see if they could get into your backup software, and if they could, they wouldn't just go in and delete your jobs or something like that, because then you'd get a notification that the job didn't run or the job failed or whatever. They'll modify your backups so that it's only backing up one file instead of your whole system. And then they'll wait a couple weeks, a month, whatever. And they'll even wait for like a long weekend. And on Friday before a long weekend, then they'll fire it off the encryption. And that gives the encryption job the most time to run and encrypt the most files before it's likely that someone will detect it. And then come Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever, after your long weekend, people roll back into work and discover that they can't access their files. And then the IT person goes and tries to restore backups. They discover that, yes, the backups were running, but they've only got one file on the whole job instead of the thousands of files that you used to have. And then after that, and this is where we are now, is they'll get on a system, assess the system that they're on, figure out is it a high value target or just some home user system, take some files off of the system, set those aside, then do their homework on the backups and all that, then wait for the long weekend, encrypt all your stuff, and along with the ransom note, they'll say that, oh, and by the way, if you just think you're going to restore from backups that you kept off-site or something, we're going to release this sensitive information that we pulled off your network. And they may or may not have that information, but you can find out if you try to call their bluff or whatever. But I mean, you're dealing with criminals, so yeah. So how do they get onto your system? How do they initiate this attack? Well, it's pretty much how any hacker attacks any system. They're going to go for the least amount of effort, easiest way first. So they're going to send you phishing emails or spear phishing if they're going to target a certain organization. Certain types of organizations are bigger targets than others. Healthcare, huge target right now. Also, managed service providers like Extra Mile are a huge target because with healthcare, there's a huge urgency to the situation, and they're most likely to be able to come up with the funds to pay. Managed service providers, if they can hack a company like Extra Mile, they don't hack one company, they hack tens or hundreds of companies. So they'll go after through the standard email attacks. Another thing is they'll go on the dark web and buy password lists from websites that have been hacked, and then they'll try those credentials on your system. And that's pretty common because people tend to reuse passwords. Then they'll also just try brute force default credentials on devices and stuff and see if they can get on the network. And really, they only need to get a toehold on the network. They don't need to get an administrator account right out of the gate. If they can get in with the secretary or receptionist or janitor's account that has very little access to the network, sometimes that's all they need. They get on, they get access to one part of the system, drop a few files there that everyone has access to, and then wait for somebody with higher privileges to give that file the old double click and open it up and unleash it. Another thing that they'll do is when they find a vulnerability in something, even if it's been around a while, they'll use certain websites to find out what companies are still using that software and then try to attack those companies. The flip side of that is they'll wait for a new vulnerability to be released, and then they'll work as fast as they can to exploit that vulnerability. In 2021, we saw something that we hadn't seen before in the IT community in the United States. Microsoft had a 0-day bug in Exchange Server, and within days, there were hackers actively exploiting the vulnerabilities to start taking over systems. But once they got onto a system, remember, they didn't encrypt it right away. They started doing recon on the system to see what was on there before they took further actions. So that bought some companies a little bit of time and gave them time to patch. But the thing that was interesting and that there was a first-time event was the FBI somehow got lists of companies that they could tell were running those Exchange servers, and were reaching out to them saying, hey, we noticed the system isn't patched. You need to patch it and fix that hole quick. So that was kind of interesting. Um, and the FBI has an interest in this because for all those systems that get hacked, companies typically reach out to the FBI and Secret Service for assistance. And it's sad to say, most of the time there's not much they can do. In fact, the Secret Service, from the people that I've talked to, won't even look into a case unless you actually lose more than $100,000. If you'd actually lose more than that, they won't look into it. And even if they do look into it, because our legal system works off of evidence, and there's so little evidence because this stuff is done anonymously, they don't do much besides add it to the tally of victims that year. And then the another thing they'll do, and this list is by no means exhaustive, this is just the common ways they get onto a system, is they'll search for routers that don't have the firmware updated and have a vulnerability in firewalls and that kind of stuff, and website apps or things like that that are still hanging out there that aren't patched up to date. They'll try to exploit those and get on those systems. So what can you do about it? The number one thing that you can do if you're an end user, administrator, whoever, wherever you are in the company, is to use a password manager and use two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication wherever you can. And the reason I'm saying use a password manager is if you don't use a password manager, then that means you're going to try to remember passwords, which often means that you're going to reuse the same password over and over. And if a hacker cracks your password on one website, now they've got it to all the other ones. And there's automated tools for them to feed a username password combo, like your email address and the password they found on one website, into a whole bunch of other websites to try to get in, which is why the two-factor authentication is so important. If you did use it, or if it did get cracked, unless they're holding your cell phone in their hand that's generating that two-factor code, they're not going to be able to finish logging into that system and infect it. Now, the other things on this list are pretty much things that, unless you're in IT, you're going to have to lean on your IT department to do. But if it's your home system, make sure Windows updates are set to automatic and that it's going to reboot at 3 a.m. after it installs the patches. Next generation antivirus. This is stuff like Sentinel-1, and Sophos has a product where the antivirus software doesn't just rely on signatures of known malicious software. It watches the behavior of a program. So if it sees a program that it doesn't recognize, and that program starts making changes to a whole bunch of files on the system, it shuts it down and stops it, and then alerts your management console. And then if it was a legitimate program, like maybe you got some new backup software that should be touching lots of files or something like that, then you can go and whitelist it and allow it. But if it is something like a CryptoLocker or Conti or one of Petya or WannaCry or any of the other ransomware variants, then it's going to stop it after it only encrypts a few files. And most of them have it built in where they're then able to restore that file to a recent date and time so they can roll it back. And Sentinel-1 is putting their money where their mouth is. The big print says they've got $1 million anti-ransomware guarantee. The small print says it's $1,000 per system, but nobody likes losing $1,000 or two or three or four, however many systems get infected. So um, that says a lot for their confidence in the product. The next thing, and I put it further down on the list for a reason. Those other things are going to prevent or stop an infection that's underway. Backups are what you're going to resort to if you do get crypto lockered. And there's companies that, even though they have solid backups, still pay the ransom because the CEO will do the math on how long it says the IT department says it's going to take to recover, and they realize that if they pay the ransom and get the decryption key, the decryption tool can run faster than restoring their backups. So as part of your backup strategy, you want to say, okay, how long is it going to take me to do a restore if my whole system gets encrypted? And is that a reasonable amount of time for how much we depend on the system? And then the last thing on the list is insurance. Now, insurance companies have stopped offering cyber insurance to some industries, and to others, they'll offer two different types of cyber insurance. They'll call them both cyber insurance, but what they actually mean by the policy is totally different. In one way, they're protecting your company against having to pay out credit monitoring and those types of things if your patient records are affected. If it looks like a hacker got on your system and then exfiltrated off a bunch of your patients' names, addresses, social security numbers, sensitive stuff, and then threatened you with it, the insurance company will step in after the breach and pay to do credit monitoring and that type of thing. But they won't pay a dime to recover your data. The other type of coverage, they'll pay for remediation, and in some cases they'll pay for actually paying the ransom to get your data back if that looks like the only thing possible. Those types of policies, you can expect they're going to have a really high deductible on it because the way the numbers are, these attacks are getting more and more frequent and costing more and more money, and insurance is all about the likelihood of having to pay out and what it's going to cost them if they do. And so those ones are getting really expensive. So when you look at the cost of some of those policies, a lot of companies are looking at it and saying, wow, if we just put that money into security, like immutable backups, that's kind of a more recent term that we're hearing now. And that's where you have a backup that's going to the cloud, that even your backup software can't modify the data once it's backed up. And the backup software can't be modified from the local server as to what files it's backing up. So another system off-site somewhere can modify the backup job and maybe exclude a directory or something like that from the backup. But if someone gets onto your network, onto your server, they can't modify it from there. So that's a good thing to check into when you're planning your whole policy and incident response plan and all the things that go along with this stuff. So I hope you find that information helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact Extra Mile Technology Services and we'd be happy to help.